In terms of assigning load, so the research will often talk about 4 different methods of assigning load. So we're going to now talk a little bit more about using a sled. So you've got a harness and you've got a sled device, and then you can put kind of different weighted plates on top of it. That's what we're going to talk about at this point. But as I said, we'll come on to some of the more general messages about resisted sled sprinting, which would then be more applicable for if you don't have a sled or you've got different ways of resisting sprinting as well. So there are 4 different methods. We've got absolute load, we've got a percentage of body mass, we've got a percentage of velocity decrement, and we've got a percentage of maximal resisted sled load, which can be shortened to MRSL. And an absolute load is where you would just give an athlete 20 kilograms. There's no necessarily thought process behind how that weight is corresponded in their body mass, or how that weight maybe has an effect on their mechanics or on the amount of speed they lose by adding load. It's just saying for this group of 10 athletes, and these might be male, female, aged 13 through to 18, you as a group are going to do 20 kilograms. That would be an absolute load. In terms of the percentage of body mass, that is, as the name says, assigning a load as a result of the body mass of an athlete. So generally speaking, this is quite an easy method to use for assigning load to athletes. And again, we'll come on to a little bit later as to what types of percentages you might use to get different effects. As I said, all you need to know about their athlete is their body mass. Again, if you're working with younger age groups and potentially vulnerable athletes who you might not want to have that conversation with, this again is probably a conversation which you have to be aware of if you need to have that conversation in the first place, or whether or not you can use your eyes and make judgments based on the way that they're moving the sled and stuff like that. But as I said, generally, this can be a really easy method to apply. The downside about this method is that body mass isn't necessarily indicative of someone's ability to accelerate. So I've got 2 athletes on here on screen, one who no doubt the majority of you will hopefully know, Usain Bolt on the left. And we've got Romelu Lukaku, the former Manchester United forward, now at Inter Milan. And these guys, Usain Bolt at his best, were roughly very similar weights. So if we were assigning some resisted sled sprinting to Usain Bolt and Romelu Lukaku, they would have very, very similar weights on the sled. As I'm sure you know, Usain Bolt's acceleration capabilities are light years ahead of Romelu Lukaku's. So even though they're carrying the same sled weight, if we're saying you guys are going to run with 30% of body mass on the sled, their acceleration capabilities are very different. So the one thing I would say about body mass percentage and using this as a method for assigning load is, though it is easy to do, it perhaps doesn't give you a particularly individualized effect across your cohort of athletes. I said you might have 2 athletes who weigh very similar, but actually have very different acceleration capabilities. And again, I know from experience within my own group, if I was to assign load using this method, someone would be losing out, because ultimately it would suit one individual and perhaps wouldn't suit another individual. The third method that we discussed of assigning sled load is the percentage of time / the percentage of velocity decrement. And this is probably the hardest one, or one of the harder ones to get your head around. And the last 2 I'm going to talk about are probably slightly more complex. But in essence, when you add load via a sled, the athlete is going to move slower than if they were unresisted. So what this method of assigning load tries to do is that it assesses the percentage loss of speed compared to an unresisted run when adding external load. So I've just picked some arbitrary numbers here. For a 15-meter time, let's say an athlete runs 2.5 seconds. If we then put 5K of resistance on a sled and they run it in 2.65 seconds, that 5 kilograms of load would represent a 6% velocity decrement. if we added a 15 kilogram load and their time to 15 dropped to 3 seconds, that would represent a 20% velocity decrement. Likewise, if we added a load of 25 kilograms, they might run 3.45 seconds, and that would represent a velocity decrement of 38%. So within the literature, and we'll come on to some of the summary statements in a minute, it might talk about for early acceleration, use a weight which is above 30% of their velocity decrement. So if you wanted to work on initial acceleration, 5 kilograms and a 15 kilogram load might not be enough, because that might only result in a 20% velocity decrement or less. So if you want to work on that initial acceleration and the research is saying use above 30% of a velocity decrement, you might have to use 25 kilograms on the sled, and so on and so forth. So that's how the percentage of velocity decrement works. The one good thing about this is that it does become a much more individualized approach. The downside is that you have to test with your athletes and then retest with your athletes potentially every 6 weeks or so as to what weights are doing to their unresisted sprints. So yes, you can produce an individualized effect, but you need to have some tests in place to see what different loads on the sled do to their 15-meter time or their 20-meter time, or however far you want to use it over. The last method of assigning load that we're going to use, and there'll be kind of an opportunity for questions in a minute. I see that some are putting them in, which is great. As said, please do interact with the chat box, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. The last method of assigning load is the percentage of maximal resisted sled load, i.e. the percentage of MRSL. What I've put on here is the Usain Bolt race model, looking at Usain Bolt's velocity at certain points, at certain distances within his world record run in Berlin in 2009. And the reason that I've put this in is that what we can see from this is that when the athlete starts in that bottom left corner of the graph at 0, i.e. they're static, the athlete will accelerate through to somewhere between potentially 40 to 60 meters, potentially less than that, depending on their ability. It might be that they accelerate up to 30 meters if they're slightly younger or don't have such a high top end speed. But in essence, we get this acceleration curve, which rises. And then at some point, it starts to plateau as the athlete moves towards their maximum velocity phase. What MRSL is looking at, and again, there'll be a few slides to follow in this, hopefully to make it clearer, is that it is a load in which the athlete remains in a state of plateau between 10 to 15 and 15 to 20 meters. So if I slide on to the next slide, hopefully this will give you a bit more detail. So you set an athlete with a load and you ask them to sprint out over 20 meters. What you'll then need to have the capacity to do is to make to time their splits between 10 and 15 meters and 15 and 20 meters. And when that time between 10 and 15 is the same as it is between 15 and 20, that would be deemed their 100% of MRSL. If we look at the graph on the left, if they were to do this unresisted, your athlete would continue to be getting quicker through that point. So their time at 10 to 15 meters would be slower than it would be between 15 and 20, because that athlete is continuing to get faster. As you start to apply load to someone, that difference in speed is going to start to come closer and closer together. And when you get to the point where their 10 to 15 is equal to their 15 to 20, that would be deemed your MRSL. The benefit of this method, similar to the one that we discussed previously, is that you can provide a really individualized load for an athlete. And we'll come on to what the research says about this in a bit. But you can provide a really individualized load. The downside is that you have to have the capacity to test at different loads, and you have to have the capacity to split between 10 to 15 and 15 to 20. So what we're going to do is we're going to now look at this this execution, so this experiment, as we'll call it, this run over 20 meters in relation to the speed distance graph, as shown with Usain Bolt's run. So if we slide across to this slide, as we can see, the black line on top represents what Usain Bolt did unresisted. So in that run, he continued to accelerate all the way between 10 and 20 meters. That curve, his velocity is still going upwards, still starting to take off. What Usain Bolt then might do, if he wanted to work out what his MRSL was, is that he might apply a load to the sled. And while that might slow him down, he still might be continuing to accelerate from 10 to 15 and 15 to 20. So that would be deemed the red line. So if there wasn't enough load on the sled and it was too light, then he would still continue to accelerate through that portion. If he then put a markedly heavier load on the sled, he would be able to accelerate to 10, might get to 13, 14 meters, and then would potentially nosedive off a cliff and get slower between 15 and 20. So then at some point, there will be a load whereby he can get to 10 and he's still accelerating at 10. He then starting to plateau between 10 and 15 and just has enough energy to get to 20 meters without slowing down or without speeding up. That would be his 100% of MRSL. So as I said, this is quite a complex one to get your head around. It might be one which some of you might have some questions on now, or it might be one that you have to go back and look at. My advice, in all seriousness, would be to potentially to not use this method. I think this method is a complex method. I think that you can do more from just using your eyes, and we'll come on to that in a minute, as to, I think, what your responsibility is as coaches. But as I said, that is MRSL. I said you have too light a weight and you'll continue to accelerate. You have too heavy a weight and you might get to 15 and then totally fall off a cliff. Or you have that right weight and you can get to 10, you can get to 15, and you can just about hold on for 20. That is your 100% MRSL. Some simple summary statements about the research. Generally speaking, sprint adaptations seem to be velocity specific. So if you're going to use heavy loads and your athlete is going to move slowly, that is going to have better transfer for maybe them first two steps of the acceleration, where the velocities are much lower. So generally speaking, heavier loads are more applicable to early acceleration, where velocities are slower and the muscular force demands are higher. So again, for me, that's something which you can assess with your eyes. You don't have to use MRSL or body weight. You can look at the athlete and ask yourself, okay, what am I working on? I want to work on an initial acceleration. Is this athlete, does this look really easy for the athlete? You know what? In that case, there might be the opportunity to add more load and actually slow them down a little bit to work on some of the muscular strength characteristics. Again, you don't necessarily need a percentage of body mass or a percentage of MRSL. Use your eyes and experiment with that. And again, we'll look at some of the applications potentially of this in the second half of this presentation. Lighter loads may have more applicability for maximum velocity improvements, but light loads on the sled may not be better than not using a load at all. So I have seen coaches use a really light load and do runs over 40, 50 meters. And I can see why they might do that. The one thing it encourages athletes to do, I think, is to accelerate their foot stronger into the floor. Because they've got load behind them, they might hammer down into the floor with a little bit more velocity or intent. So again, as a training teaching tool, I think absolutely, I think there can be some benefits. And I've seen some really good coaches use some really light loads through to 40 and 50 meters. Again, is it the only tool in that coach's toolbox? No, they'll run unresisted runs as well. So generally speaking, some of the research is a little bit conflicted as to whether or not, if you want to work on maximum velocity, whether or not you would put any load on it at all. As I said, as a training tool, you might do, but if you're looking to develop some of the physical qualities of of maximum velocity, then you might not. Heavier loads support horizontal force production by assisting a greater forward trunk lean. So if you are standing at your computer, and I can imagine everyone doing this around the country right now, stand up from your computer. And actually, I might do this as well. I'll do it as a demo. I want you just to stand up, and I want you to just lean forward for me, please. So you're going to lean forward, and at some point, you're going to take a step. If I've got load on my back, what I'm then able to do is to become a lot more horizontally supported. So rather than having no load, and therefore I can't get too horizontal before I take a step, if I've got load supporting me, particularly a heavy load, I'm then able to become much more horizontal. As we said back in the beginning of this presentation, acceleration, one of the real performance characteristics of acceleration is the ability to produce horizontal force. So that's where resisted sled sprinting can help, because resisted sled sprinting, if you put a heavy load on the sled, can support a more horizontal position and therefore can enable you to produce more horizontal force.